välkomna och framförallt först och främst välkommen dagens moderator Lisa Pelling.
Tack så mycket. Tack. Welcome to Stockholm, everyone that is following this series of events to celebrate the Day of the Nordic Regions and the presentation of the State of the Nordic Region 2022. The topic of the event that we are celebrating here in Stockholm today and that I have the honor to moderate is closed borders and cross-border labor. How do they coexist? And the topic is a very dear one, not least to the almost 500,000 Nordic citizens who live and work in another Nordic country than the one where they were born. They comprise around 2% of the Nordic population, and at the same time they are kind of the heart of Nordic cooperation. How to deal with our common region, how to make sure that people can move freely over borders, how to make sure that people can have their everyday lives, their families, their studies, their labor in this integrated and ever more integrated region. We will start today by a short welcoming by the Swedish Minister for Nordic Cooperation, Anna Hallberg. Then we would be presented with the chapter of the report that is particularly dedicated to our topic on closed borders and cross-border labor. And then we'll have a panel discussion with some very distinguished guests as well. We are live streaming this, but we also have some audience here at Kulturhuset who will have the privilege afterwards to stay on and ask some questions. Unfortunately, we will not be able to take questions during the live streaming. With this said, I give the floor to Anna Hallberg. Please, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Lisa. And good morning to everyone. It's indeed a privilege for me as a Minister for Nordic Affairs and Minister for Foreign Trade to be here today. The subject is indeed relevant for both of these responsibilities for me in the Swedish government. And also today we celebrate the Nordic Day, and we also have the launching of a State of the Nordic Region report for 2022, which is indeed very interesting. But as we gather here today, of course, it's under the cloud of the unprovoked and terrible Russia's illegal and indefensible invasion of Ukraine. All free democratic countries in Europe have acted resolute and together and united in sanctions against Russia and united in support for Ukraine. And as Nordic countries, it's indeed so obvious in these days that we share the fundamental values. And this can really facilitate, of course, a stronger Nordic cooperation, but it would also strengthen us as individual countries, as well as a region. So this is really a time for coming together and feel that we are at the same level when it comes to values, to democratic values, to the platform that we have built. And this is needed more than ever in these days. And then we have the pandemic, and it was a strain on many levels, even putting the Nordic cooperation to a real test. It hasn't been easy these last 2 years, and I'm the first to admit that, of course. But we have also been able to agree on certain measures to mitigate the negative consequences of pandemic-related travel restrictions, for instance. And now also with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we are likely to face similar challenges that may also again challenge the inter-Nordic mobility. Let us be open with that, because when we are open and when we put challenges on the table immediately and early, then we have also the possibility to together find the solutions, not too late, but initially in a crisis. And not being able to meet the challenges as one region has led to a lack of belief in the vision of a united Nordic region. Again, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but we have to be realistic when we talk about the challenges that we have faced the last couple of years. And this is something that me and my Nordic colleagues has really taken seriously. We must strive to restore the trust as quickly as possible. We must strive for open borders and a cross-border mobility, of course. It's absolutely essential, not only for people and people relations, but also when it comes to competitiveness and economic growth in our region. How would investors be able to or dare to invest in our cross-border regions, in the border regions, when we close the borders from time to time? So this is in so many levels such an important issue. And we must strive in the governments, of course, to restore this trust as quickly as possible. We can do this by showing our commitment both through visibility out there in our respective countries and by being sensitive to the problems that we have experienced and to actually resolve occurring issues. I intend to pursue my ambition to create a more structured cooperation because we need structure here. We need structure for dialogue, structure for our authorities to cooperate in a better manner. And we need joint analysis together between the Nordic countries to better prepare for the next crisis, which we have already entered into. The State of the Nordic Region report could form a really good basis for the analysis of the implications of the policy decisions. So, I will now participate in a panel and discussions here, and I do look forward to that. And later on, we have also an event in the Parliament. So this is a day for us who are friends of the Nordic cooperation. This is a day for the Nordic region. I do look forward to now talk to my fellow panelists an issue that is very dear to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. You can take your chair here. Thank you so much. Good. And I think we all got the message, a great friend of Nordic cooperation, and there is indeed a lot to learn about the challenges in detail about the Nordic cooperation. And one of the issues that we are focusing on today is the issue of labor market mobility. I'd like to ask here on stage Anna Lundberg. You are a senior research fellow at Nordic Region, and you are a co-author of the State of the Nordic Region 2022 report, but specifically you've written a chapter entitled Labor Market Mobility Between Nordic Countries During the COVID-19 Pandemic. And this you have authored together with Mari Voyen-Meyer. And you will now present this chapter to us. Please welcome on stage, Anna.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and it is a true pleasure to be here today to speak to you on this Nordic Day and to share with you also some of the findings from this publication, State of the Nordic Region. We have, now let's see if I can change slide. Thank you. So State of the Nordic Region is a publication that is published every second year by Nordic Region, and it is a compilation of statistics and data on the Nordic region. This time we have produced some 29 graphs and maps that you see here. And State of the Nordic Region covers three thematic areas every year. It's demography, it's economic issues, and it's labor market. And this is actually the 18th edition of the State of the Nordic Region, and we are a bunch of researchers from Nordic Region putting together this publication every second year. And as Lisa said here, I will talk a little bit more about labor market mobility. And as you know, one of the main strategies to reduce the spread of the COVID-19 virus was to restrict mobility and to introduce social distancing. And this was not only encouraged, it was proclaimed to a large extent. And we saw it in different forms through travel restrictions, restrictions, quarantine rules, we saw discouragement, we saw testing regimes, and all these together made up a number of mobility barriers. And those mobility barriers in terms of health effects, we can see that those mobility barriers had some effects on the spread of the virus. But when we talk about the labor market that we talk about here today, it has mostly negative effects. It made it difficult for people to go to school, to go to work, and to see friends and family. And overall, we can see an average level of decrease in work mobility of 23% across the Nordics. And this data is based on Google mobility data. And as you can see of the graph presented here below, you can see that the main timing, the main dips were the second and the third quarters of 2020 and the third quarter of 2021. But you can also see that to a large extent, the Nordic countries seem to follow each other. We can see that Sweden, which is yellow, had a less of a dip in work mobility in the very beginning of the pandemic, but then the pattern is quite similar across the Nordics. And then if you look to the or to the right, sorry, you see the map with the number of panels. And basically in these panels, the more red the color is, the larger the reduction in work mobility. And this shows that we also saw differences not only between the Nordic countries, but also between municipalities and regions and sectors. There was especially some sectors that were affected by these restrictions in mobility, mainly the tourism sector, the hospitality sector, but also retail, transport, logistics, and manufacturing. Basically, those sectors where working from home was not really an option, because that was another strategy during this pandemic. And we have also seen a quite large increase in remote work during the pandemic. And if we look at the pattern, how that is spread between municipalities and regions, we can see that those jobs that people can perform remotely are found in the urban areas, but also in the rural areas. Another group that were especially affected by these restrictions in mobility were the commuters, and especially the international commuters or the Nordic commuters that had to cope not only with the national rules, but also with international rules or the rules of the country where they were going. And there were also regional rules and local rules in some instances. And in the Nordics, we have approximately 49,000 commuters that live in one country, Nordic country, and work in another Nordic country. And these figures are based on figures from 2015 to 2018. So here we have a lack of accurate and more recent statistics. But those are the latest statistics. This, to the commuters, the lack of cross-border mobility imposed really a hard time. As I mentioned, there were different rules in different countries. There was also a lack of information. The furlough schemes and testing rules and quarantine rules differed between the countries. So, for instance, for a while it was not possible for Swedes to go to Norway to work. It was possible for Norwegians to go to Sweden to work, but when coming back, they had to stay in quarantine, which made it very, very difficult. And also in the Öresund region, where train commuting is very common, this caused a lot of delays, and that, of course, was a great frustration to those people commuting. However, when we talk about, if we can change slide, when we talk about labor market mobility in the Nordics, we need to talk not only about commuting, but also about migration. And here you see a map to the right, where you can see the largest minority. And you can see from where the largest minority in the different Nordic countries come. And as you can see in this map, it's people are not moving from anywhere to everywhere. There are some clear patterns here, although these are the largest minorities, so it doesn't mean that we only have Swedes in Finland and Finns in Sweden, except for the Norwegian border, where we have a large proportion of Norwegians. We have a large proportion of Swedes in Norway, and in the southern part of Norway we find a lot of Danes. In the southern part of Sweden we find a lot of also of Danes. And the largest minority in the individual municipalities and regions in Denmark, the purple color here, are from Greenland. However, in absolute terms, it is Swedes that are the largest minority, and you can also say in the greater capital region, the largest minority is Swedes. So this shows, and also in Faroe Islands, Greenland, and Iceland, you can see that the largest minority is Danish people. So this shows that proximity, different kinds of proximity matters, not only geographical proximity, but also language proximity and cultural proximity and historical proximity. And we, as I mentioned before, 49,000 people per year commute to a job in a Nordic country. That is 0.5 in comparison to the EU average, which is 1%. And we have other countries in the Nordics where we see a larger proportion of commuters. For example, Slovakia with some 5%. We have Estonia. We have Luxembourg with higher figures. So in an international comparison here, or European comparison, it doesn't seem that we stand out as a large commuting region, the Nordics. However, as I said, we need also to look into the migration, and 40,000 people per year move to another country, and as was mentioned here earlier, 458,000 people live in another Nordic country than the one that they were born in, which makes up 1.7%. And then to sum up, there has been severe effects on labor market mobility from the COVID, both when it comes to commuting, but also when it comes to migration between the countries, and the international migration went down quite severely. Yet we have this Nordic vision that we want to fulfill, to become the most integrated region in the world. And by that we intend that it must be possible to move, to commute, to work, and to live in another Nordic country. And I would say we have a potential here, because if we look into migration in general in the Nordic countries, we're quite or changing of residence, we're quite a moving, mobile people in the Nordics, where we see mobility in the last state of the Nordic region in figures like 13 to 16% every year change residence. So I would say there is a potential here, but we need to build that trust that you mentioned, and to faith that we can actually move and live in another Nordic country, and that we can still take part in all the welfare services that that are usually connected to living in a country. And this also means this potential, it also includes the larger labor markets, which are important. By larger labor markets, we can create more jobs, which is is important. And we can also create larger markets for businesses. So there are several advantages to this integrated Nordic region that I think that we should highlight more. However, we need to remove the cross-border obstacles. We need to improve and share statistics. That is, without statistics, we are lacking information here. And we need to take advantage of the cross-border regions that are our frontline actors here when it comes to mobility. But we also need to look at this from a multi-level governance perspective. We need to include the national level, the regional level, and the local level. This is not something that can be fulfilled solely by the cross-border regions. To do this, we need to engage the nation states, the regions, and the local authorities. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you. Well done presenting such a wealth of statistics in such a short period of time. I welcome up the panel because we need to have time for a short panel discussion as well. Can I ask Magnus Ek to join us, please? Yes. Magnus Ek, you're Member of Parliament for the Centre Party and also Chair of the Nordic Council Sustainability Commission, and Johan Strange, who is Associate Professor at the Centre for Nordic Studies at Helsinki University. I ask the first question to you, Anna. I know you have to rush off to another meeting. It's a very busy times, not least because of the massive cross-border movements that we see in our region just now. My question to you would be, when you look back at the COVID-19 pandemic, what could be learned from this crisis to avoid such obstacles to inter-Nordic mobility next time there is a crisis, or even maybe in this crisis, if you're there? What can we learn from the crisis?
Absolutely, we must learn from every crisis, and that is an absolutely must, and we do. I think one of the main lessons learned is that even though every country has of course the mandate to have decisions regarding their own borders, that is fundamental, of course. But with that said, I think we need to much more communicate when it comes to how can we, if we have to close borders, that is the worst thing we can do for this open and integrated Nordic region. But if we have to do that for one reason or another, how can we have exceptions together? How can we decide on what kind of exceptions can we have for students, for the work, for commuters, for transports, and also for people living, for residents in the cross-border municipalities? And from the beginning, there were no exceptions. It was just closed borders in a very quick way. And that was dramatic, and that was terrible for all these people and companies and so on, dependent on the open borders. What we then learned, and actually did also at the end of this pandemic period, was that we could agree on some kind of exceptions together. How can we facilitate for commuters and students and so on? That's what we must continue with those discussions and also see, can we, as I said earlier, how can we initially decide together on these exceptions? That's one thing. The information has been terrible for many people because they haven't been able to follow what is happening right now. That people are trying to find information, but it has been different from respective countries. That's also one very pragmatic thing. But if I might just conclude this remark by saying that I think the most fundamental thing to do is that in every single Nordic government we need to have the Nordic perspective when we take decisions. It might be to close borders, it might be for the Minister for Social Welfare, it might be Minister for Transport and so on. How can we, every time we take a decision that influences or affects another or neighbor country, how can we communicate and how can we also see to that we try to really have the Nordic perspective in a much more structured way in the respective government? I think that's the main thing.
Yeah. Do you see this happening now with the refugee crisis? I'm thinking of introducing controls to cross borders for the Ukrainian refugees, or maybe different.
Well, I see that the dialogue is definitely there now. It wasn't at the beginning of the pandemic. We try to have the dialogue. We now introduce the possibility, for instance, for ID checks, but how will that function in practice? Yes. And that is the communication we have to have with the other government. So we're not just doing it on our own and then see what's happening at the other country or at the border. So that's much more of an awareness of that we need to have the dialogue and find solutions together.
I know this is part of why your schedule is so extremely busy now at the time. Magnus Ek, you're a member of the Swedish Parliament, but you're also one of these many politicians who put aside time in your calendar to also attend meetings of the Nordic Council, and in cooperation with the other Nordic politicians, you have accepted to chair the Committee on Sustainability of the Nordic Council. What, in your view...
You make it sound like it's something awful. That I sacrifice myself to do this.
Well, all politicians are busy. To you, what's the value of doing this kind of effort together with Nordic colleagues? What's the promise of this kind of Nordic cooperation?
Yeah, and that was kind of my point. That it's not a sacrifice I make. It's something that I value and something that I wanted to do, that I asked to get the chance to do within my party. Fantastically enough, there was a bit of competition for actually working with the Nordic issues within our parliamentary party group. And I think the value is obvious to each and every one of us who work with the Nordic cooperation, who work across borders in the Nordic region, who has roots in another Nordic country. I mean, there are very few drawbacks of Nordic integration. There are very few drawbacks or downsides to integrating more, cooperating more, lending force to one another, helping one another achieve our common goals. But there is so much to gain. And I think that's something that really for me has just been confirmed over these years working both in my party's youth wing and with the Nordic Centre Party Youth, which is a very old and well-established cooperation between the youth wings in the Nordic region. And after that in Parliament and then within the Nordic Council. What I think is kind of tragic is how we have seen that is not a universal view in politics in Sweden or the other Nordic countries, and that has become very apparent during the pandemic. For example, I mean, closing borders, not really because it's something that will really help us combat the pandemic, but to seem tough and decisive. And I think we should always be a bit suspicious of politicians trying to be tough and decisive. I like politicians that can explain, why are we taking measure X and Y? What have we considered instead of taking measure X and Y? And how have we communicated with our neighbors and with our partners before making this decision? And I think that's what we've been seeing lacking. I think Minister Hallberg is completely right in that aspect. And sadly, I don't see that improved very much during the pandemic. And now, again, we're hearing from Swedish ministers that what we should do to combat the crisis in Ukraine is to reintroduce ID checks on our border with Denmark for absolutely no apparent reasons. There are already ID controls at the Danish border with Germany. So what in God's name is the purpose of reintroducing these checks, which we know and which has been screened from the Scandinavian region and from the Öresund region for years, that this really hurts the Nordic cooperation. This damages the trust from the citizens working in Denmark, Swedish citizens working in Denmark and vice versa, and that this is something that they can continue to. And yet we keep making these rash decisions and, from my point of view, mistakes.
Yes.
And I think we really have to, a part of learning from our mistakes is come to grips with, why do we keep making the same mistakes over and over? And what kind of structure, as we have heard here, what kind of structure should we introduce to make sure that we have actually the communication, that we don't keep making these same mistakes over and over again?
I think that's a perfect handover to Johan Strang, who I'd like to give us a little bit of the longer perspective. How come, Magnus says, we keep doing the same mistakes? We've just come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we realize we are not cooperating, we are not coordinating enough in the Nordic region. We're moving into the next crisis, and again, we seem to have a region that is not coordinated, that is not cooperating enough, not taking enough common decisions. Is this something that has been the mark of the Nordic region? What would be your perspective on this Nordic cooperation?
Yeah, where to start? I think that from a longer historical perspective, I mean, the passport union and the common labor market, they were established in the 50s, and they worked pretty okay up until the refugee crisis in 2015. So when border checks were when we started initiated this process of having border checks and border controls, and since then there has been several occasions where governments have opted to close borders for some kind of reason. So I think that it has become, like, border politics has become an accepted kind of part of a government's toolbox, and this is quite a new thing within the Nordic region, I think, and we need to face up to that challenge, and the big question is how we can reverse this trend, because we are really at a risk that people are losing their trust. We were talking about trust, and the trust in open borders. So this report that we have read today is it always says that it's too early to tell, but I think that I'm really looking forward to 2024, when the next one comes up, and see whether we have been able to come over this, because this is just about the pandemic, but the important thing is how we get over it. And I think that the border politics needs to be understood in connection with a more general trend of a crisis of international cooperation. So I'm concerned with the laxness by which our politicians have started to break these international agreements, like the passport union, like the Schengen deal, etc. So if our leaders don't respect international agreements, how can we expect that crazy dictators accept international law and international agreements? So is it a surprise that the invasion of Ukraine took place after the refugee crisis, the Brexit, the financial crisis, which has all pointed to a weakness in the unity of the West? But now I hope that we are kind of reversing that, and exactly as you say, we are now showing some unity.
Would you like to comment upon that, Anna, from the Swedish government perspective? Do you think that this time around the Nordic governments will handle the crisis differently? More unity, more coordinated, more of common responses?
Well, I hope so, because we have really learned some lessons from the pandemic. But on the other hand, of course, no one has intention or I think has broken any international law here. But what we're talking about is that we have some fundamental agreements, and we have more or less promised each other that we need to keep the Nordic region open. And then the pandemic came with it was such a quick way of trying to respond to a crisis that no one could really foresee. That is not really, I'm not trying to defend the decisions, because Sweden were a bit slow to close the borders, but try to understand what was happening those weeks, and we chose different paths here in the Nordic governments. But I can only speak for the Swedish government, of course, but I'm quite sure that it's not about the Nordic politicians trying to be tough here. It's about being in a very acute situation where we listen to what do the experts say, what do the science say here, what can we do, and then we took different decisions in the Nordic region, between the Nordic countries. But I think that we need to rebuild the trust again by showing that we understand what needs to be done. If we have to close the borders or introduce ID checks or whatever it is, we have really to, and then back to the exceptions, try to make the daily life in the Nordic border regions at least possible to go through with, and to possible to commute and so on. And so I think that's really, I can't promise that we never close the borders again and never introduce ID checks again. But I think we can do much more to listen into what the citizens demand from us as governments. So I try to do my best as a Minister for Nordic Cooperation, but again, it's about the entire governments to really take this responsibility, and I think we should never give up pushing that agenda.
Thank you, Anna. Magnus, did you want to comment?
Yeah, if I could first just comment. I mean, we were quite late in the pandemic when we introduced border checks at the Swedish-Norwegian border. And that was after, discussing with our neighboring countries how they might have been a bit rash in their decisions to close borders. And then a year or more into the pandemic, we did exactly the same thing, and we hadn't really thought about how are we going to do it, which effects will it have, and the effect was just a breach of trust and an added confusion. And also, we couldn't do this in a unified way. I read Finnish papers about truck drivers, lorry drivers, who were completely denied crossing, Finnish lorry drivers who couldn't cross the border between Norway and Sweden, coming into Sweden at one point, and then just driving 50 miles north, and they just waved them over the border. I mean, what kind of consistency is that? So I think we have to also admit the mistakes that were made and look kind of clearly and rationally at what did we do and why did we land at these decisions, and might we perhaps have been rash. I'm not saying that it might have been wrong in every instance, closing borders or decisions, which I think are often rash and not really thought through, and which, when you add them together, they do not build the trust of the citizens in the Nordic integration and the ability to move over the Nordic borders and work in other Nordic countries. And we know that that breach of trust has been one of the long-term negative effects of the pandemic on the Nordic integration.
I hear that we need to...
If I might just add one sentence or two about what do we do about this. I think really you should look to the Ian Stam report and the things he proposes there, because he actually has some proposals for what structural changes we should have to the political cooperation and to the Nordic cooperation. And I think that even if we don't want to take Ian Stam's proposals, we have really to, I think that's an interesting way of looking forward. Should we, for example, have, as he said in Malmö yesterday, should we have the Minister for Nordic Cooperation lead kind of a council of ministers within the Swedish government for Nordic cooperations? Because we see that while the Minister for Nordic Cooperation says the right thing and I think wants to do the right thing, it doesn't really reach out to the rest of the governments.
Thank you so much. You got your message across. Thank you so much, Anna. We will come back with more discussions on this. I know your co-workers here are urging you to get on to the next meeting.
Just one last comment. I fully agree with that. Just to say that when the health authorities demand from the government that you need to do something to reduce the spread of the virus, it's very difficult to go against. I just wanted to. It's not easy anyhow. But my last comment is really, I definitely think you're right there, Magnus. I think we should try to, in all the Nordic governments, have a definition of what the responsibilities for the minister responsible for Nordic cooperation, and build around that, because then we, as I said, introduce this horizontal issue immediately when we hear something, this is affecting the Nordic region. Okay, then we have to take a step back and then evaluate that. So I definitely agree on that, and let's try to work together to achieve that. So thank you very much and I'm sorry I have to leave.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much, Anna. Fortunately, we have another Anna here at the panel. I'll turn to you, Anna. I think, and now again with the ID controls and the controls on the borders between the Nordic countries in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we tend to focus on the cross-border issues when we cross the physical border. But you gave some very sobering statistics. You were saying commuters are around 49,000, but the people who have migrated, who are no longer crossing the border every day, but have crossed the border to live in another Nordic country than the one they were born in, are almost 500,000 people. Are we talking too little about the conditions and the situation of these people?
I think we need to highlight also that commuters are not only those living in immediate proximity to the borders. We also have those weekly commuters, those weekly commuting from the capital regions, for instance, between the capital regions. So in terms of integration and in terms of achieving the Nordic vision, we need to also think not only of the immediate cross-border regions, but about the whole Nordic integration. And certainly, as I said, it must be possible to move, to commute, to live and to work in different instances, and also we can expect to see more of remote working. Now we have learned how we can work from home, how we can work digitally to a large extent, and to make that possible to also work remotely across the Nordic region.
Does this mean you're counting with more people in this situation of living in another Nordic country when that?
I think we have the potential. I mean, the statistics show that the Nordic people in general are quite mobile. We could consider to change residence, but for the moment it's perhaps too much of an adventure. And after this pandemic and after the migration crisis, etc., perhaps we don't have trust to move across the Nordic borders. Because we have seen that this might work for the moment, but do we know for sure that it will work next month or next year, and what will happen with the social security systems, etc., when I move to another country? So those cross-border obstacles that hamper mobility, whether it is commuting or whether it is migration, need to be considered. And I think that is also interesting and important from a long-term perspective, reflecting on what you said, Johan, going back to the passport union and the Helsinki agreement that was now quite some time ago with a large vision about the Nordic cooperation. Where is the great vision now? We have a vision for the Nordic cooperation, but this vision is competing for interest among politicians. That is my impression. We have a lot of international association to tend our attention to not only the Nordic but also EU, etc.
Do you think there's a need for a more for a reformalization of the Nordic cooperation? It's been some 60 years since the Helsinki Agreement was signed. Do the challenges that we see now, ever more people commuting, ever more people living in a different country, we have these external pressures put upon the region in terms of pandemics. Unfortunately, we've had to realize as well that it's not the last pandemic, right? And the refugee crisis, now this is a refugee crisis again. We had one only 7 years ago. We probably are looking, towards having other refugee crises with massive border movements as well in the future. Do you think from your more long-term perspective, do you think there should be a renegotiation of the agreements?
Yeah, well. I don't think. I mean, the whole treaty. It's called the Constitution of Nordic cooperation and so forth. But it's written in a very non-committing form. It's about like the agreement parties shall seek to preserve the common labor market, or shall seek to develop cultural cooperation and so forth. And the conventions of free movement, they're not really part of this treaty, which focuses on culture and law and these kinds of things, and specifies the tasks of the Council and the Council of Ministers. I think that there is very little political will of tearing up this treaty. But I would focus on the conventions themselves, because they are dated. They were written in a time period when people when people had one workplace and they worked 100% at that workplace. They moved from one country to another country and settled there for the rest of their lives. And now people live in much more complicated relationship. They might have several employers in various countries. They might move around several times per year even, or something like that. And the conventions and all our agreements and rules, they really are unable to capture this. And when Minister Hallberg talked about these exceptions that we need to make for during the next pandemic or so, I really hope that we I mean, it's very difficult to make exceptions because people have such complicated lives. I mean, who is the exception? During this pandemic, we all the exceptions that were made were really kind of so conservative that you won't believe it. You had to be married to travel across a border, or you had to have a 100% work relationship in order to travel across the border. I mean, that automatically it excludes everyone under 50. So it's, I mean, we really need to revamp these.
So no renegotiation of the treaties, but the conventions are outdated. We soon need to close this seminar to hand over to the other countries in the region. Magnus, do you want to say something very quickly?
Yeah, I want to say two things. The first, trying to be a bit positive. I mean, even if we don't get the formal integration working better, even if we don't make the strides which I would want to see, we have some trends working on the Nordic region that will make us more integrated, whether we want to or not. For example, large corporations operating in the Nordic region don't operate in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland. They operate in the Nordic region. If you work at one of those companies, you often work in the Nordic region, whether you work out of Stockholm or Helsinki or Copenhagen. And I think those kind of trends are for us to want to see a more united Nordic region and think there are only gains to be made there. Those are positive, I mean, mega trends. And also I think as regards to the vision, I think that we might need to turn it on its head because we have this kind of vague vision of we want to be the most integrated region in the world. We just don't want to take the steps to become the most integrated region in the world. I think instead of saying, okay, so what should we do together? I think we need to kind of turn that question around and ask, what is it that we really can't do together? What can't we integrate? What can't we harmonize? Because when we look at it from that perspective, I mean, why couldn't we have a more, you know, for example, a more streamlined legislative system within the Nordic countries? Why not? Why couldn't we have a more integrated working region and labor market? Why not? And then just kind of, you know, we work where it's easy, we work where we see the most gains, and let's leave the complicated matters to another time. Fine. Okay. And I think that will take us a long way towards becoming the world's most integrated region. Yeah.
A very brutal but also very interesting proposal put on the table now that we have gone over time with our live streaming here from Stockholm. We need to hand over to our Nordic friends in Copenhagen for the next event. But all of those of you who have turned up here to Kulturhuset this morning, just stay seated and we will go on with a question and answer session. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. I promise.